Why not have a discussion and say, hey, here's why I think you're wrong. You can tell me why you think I'm wrong, but let's talk it out.
Okay, let's talk. This is Kyle Kulinski, who runs the popular YouTube channel Secular Talk. I am not subscribed to his channel, but I watch it on occasions. He is definitely one of the more decent voices in progressive media. But when it comes to his position on the Jewish state, my country Israel, his views are pretty disgraceful. So I think it is time I address this issue. And I know what you guys want to see. Yeah, well, we're not gonna do that. This is not going to be some YouTube blood sports. As I always do, I am going to take a thoughtful look at Kyle's arguments, criticize them, and show where he goes wrong. This is a serious issue, a life and death issue, and it is important that we have an honest discussion on it. So... No. Just kidding. I respect Kyle. Unlike other progressive channels, which seem to be in it just so they can feel morally superior to others, I think that he is someone who genuinely wants to make a change. And I think that he is someone who is capable of changing his mind, if you show him that he is wrong. So this is what I will attempt to do here. I'm telling you we're not doing this. Okay?
Okay.
Good. Now, what we are going to do is...
Cosmo's a bitch, she's a big fat witch, she's the biggest bitch in the whole wide world. She's a stupid bitch, and everyone's a bitch, she's a bitch to all the boys and girls.
Whatever. Everybody sing along.
On Monday she's a bitch, on Tuesday she's a bitch, and Wednesday to Saturday she's a bitch. Then on Sunday just to be different, she's a super king, Kamehameha, bitch. Come on, you all know the words. Have you ever met my pretty Cosmo? She's the biggest bitch in the whole wide world. She's a mean old bitch, and she has stupid hair, she's a bitch. She's a stupid bitch. Cosmo's a bitch, and she's just a dirty bitch. I really mean it, Cosmo. She's a big fat fucking bitch. Big old fat fucking bitch, Cosmo. Yeah.
Okay, you got what you wanted. Now let's get serious. Kyle Kulinski has been on this anti-Israel rampage for many years, and I just ignored it. So why am I making this video now? Because antisemitism on the left is becoming a serious problem, something that we need to talk about. The problem is compounded by the fact that many people on the left are unwilling to admit that the problem even exists. Recently I made a video on the Young Turks, and we saw how they deny the problem. Worse, we saw that they don't just deny it, but that they are actively spreading blatant anti-Semitic propaganda. In the case of Secular Talk, I don't see anti-Semitic propaganda coming from the channel, but he is in denial. So first of all, yay, we found a progressive who isn't an anti-Semite. Well done. But you do have some serious misconceptions, Kyle, and they are leading you to be an apologist for anti-Semites. It's time you got them corrected. Antisemitism is a shape-shifting creature, and you have to pay attention to the shifts. Up until the middle of the 20th century, antisemitism was endemic to Western culture. Practically everyone was an anti-Semite to some extent, as the stereotypes and fear of the Jew were embedded deep in the collective consciousness, and treated as common knowledge. One of the things I liked most about the internet, in its early days, is that it allowed everyone to have a voice and speak what's on their mind, and thus we could see what people are really like and where humanity stands. I was heartened to see that the West has definitely changed. There are still examples of endemic antisemitism out there, especially in the Muslim world, but when I look at Westerners talking to each other, I don't see it anymore. There is a small percentage of anti-Semites, but others are free of the old prejudices. But recently, we have been witnessing antisemitism rearing its ugly head, and what brought it about is the rise of certain ideologies that allow the old anti-Semitic words to be spoken again. We see it on the right. There are very few neo-Nazis, and they were successfully marginalized by the Western right. But what happened recently is the rise of white nationalism and race realism, which created the alt-right. Most alt-right people are not Nazis, but they are close enough for the neo-Nazis to become part of the conversation. Thus, Nazi antisemitism began to spread within the ranks of the alt-right. But the alt-right is still a very small phenomenon, and it seems to be declining. Cracks are formed within it, and the neo-Nazis are becoming marginalized again. Right-wing antisemitism may kill some Jews here and there, but it is not a serious problem. A much bigger problem is brewing on the left. Here, the social justice movement is becoming mainstream, and its hatred of Israel is allowing antisemitism to come roaring back in, and become part of the leftist mainstream discourse. In my video on the Young Turks, we saw Cenk Uygur taking a news story and twisting it into suggesting that the state of Israel is harvesting organs and selling them for profit, and maybe even intentionally killing Palestinians to get their organs. This is a classic case of an anti-Semitic blood libel, and yet Cenk had no problem spewing it out on his channel. Now, Cenk doesn't want to be an anti-Semite, and I speculated that his mind went there because of his Muslim upbringing. But the real culprit here is the leftist ideology that allowed his mind to go there. We will not find Kyle saying such vile things, but he is weak on detecting the mechanisms of this ideology, and thus weak on fighting against the antisemitism that rages around him. I'll show you what I mean. Let's begin with a recent case. Ilhan Omar, a newly elected congresswoman, one of the first Muslims to be elected to the US Congress, has made some questionable comments about Israel, leading people to accuse her of antisemitism. When leaders of Congress threatened to censure her, she tweeted, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby," implying that they are only doing it because they are under the thrall of Jewish money. She later specified that she is talking about AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby. This led to further charges of antisemitism, and Kyle was incensed.
God damn it, she's not an anti-Semite! She literally was just criticizing Israel, the government of Israel, which is a right-wing government, by the way, and criticizing the lobbying efforts of said government, buying American politicians, which they do. Saudi Arabia does it also. So it has nothing to do with an anti-Semitic trope of Jews secretly running the world. It has to do with the influence of Israeli lobby money on American politicians, which is proven.
So his claim is that she is just attacking the effects of money on American politics, and that she spoke against the harmful effect that other lobbies have as well. So it has nothing to do with antisemitism. He goes on to say that the charges of antisemitism are a tactic used to smear any kind of criticism of Israel, even legitimate criticism.
And that's not to say that there hasn't been anti-Semitism and isn't still anti-Semitism to this day, and we are opposed to that, but let's also care about Palestinians, and let's not pretend like good faith criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic.
Good faith, eh? Well, we'll see about that. First, let me say what I think about Omar's tweet. Omar is part of the Justice Democrats movement, which wants to get money out of politics, so I can accept that this is what was on her mind. The problem with the tweet is that it is an anti-Semitic trope, and the US Congresswoman should be careful not to use such tropes. But I'm willing to see this as a rookie mistake, and move on. This is easily excusable. What is inexcusable is this.
How can America work productively towards a just and lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians, in your opinion?
By having an equal approach to dealing with both. Most of the things that have always been aggravating to me is that we have had a policy that makes one superior to the other. And we mask it with a conversation that's about justice and a two-state solution when you have policies that clearly prioritize one over the other.
Such as?
Just our relationship really with the Israeli government and the Israeli state. And so when I see Israel institute law that recognizes it as a Jewish state and does not recognize the other religions that are living in it, and we still uphold it as a democracy in the Middle East, I almost chuckle because I know that if we see that in any other society, we would criticize it, we would call it out. We do that to Iran, we do that to any other place that sort of upholds its religion.
Here we see Congresswoman Omar promoting a lie that is commonly used by today's anti-Semites. The lie is that Judaism is a religion, and that Israel's definition as a Jewish state means that Judaism is its state religion, in the same way that Iran is an Islamic state. In reality, of course, Judaism is first and foremost a nationality, and Israel is Jewish only in the national sense. This was a good chance to educate people about this misconception, but once again we saw the process that typifies the national dialogue in America today. Instead of focusing on the content, and explaining why what Omar said here is a lie, they focus on microaggressions like that stupid tweet. So I guess it is down to me to explain how and why she is lying. A short history lesson. The Jewish nation existed in Israel since the 10th century BC, after breaking off from the Israeli nation that existed even before that. Now this is before the time of universal religions like Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. In those times, every nation had its own religion, and the Jewish nation was no exception. The country of Judea existed for about a millennium, at times as a sovereign country and at times occupied by a foreign empire. In the 1st century BC it was conquered by the Roman Empire, and after 2 centuries in which the Jews rebelled against it, the Romans had enough and decided to wipe Judea off the map. Most Jews went into exile, but they told themselves that the Holy Spirit, which previously resided only in the land of Israel, goes with them wherever they go. If that sounds familiar, yes, the director of Thor Ragnarok is half Jewish, and I suspect he took the end of that movie from the story of the Jews. The Jews resided in diaspora for 2 millennia, never allowed to return to their homeland by the different empires that ruled it. So what maintained the Jewish identity was the Jewish religion. However, the Jewish national identity was never forgotten, because the religion contains many rituals that preserve it. For instance, the Jews would pray every day, 3 times a day, a string of prayers called Shmona Esrei, which repeatedly refers to the Jews as a nation and contains prayers that all of the Jews will return to Israel, rebuild it, and become a sovereign nation again. Thus, the Jewish national identity was preserved, albeit as an alienated identity. In the modern age, many Jews started to lose their faith. As a result, they no longer believed in the old religious dictum that we must wait for the Messiah to come and save us, and wanted to have their national rights and be a nation like all the nations. As a result, the 19th century saw the rise of the Zionist movement, a movement that espoused the return of the Jews to Zion, to the land of Israel. In 1948, the Jews won their country back, and formed a Jewish state called Israel in their homeland. And so, Judaism is once again mainly a nationality. Anti-Semites are exploiting this complicated history to deceive the public about what Jews are. We see 2 types of deception. The right-wing anti-Semites are claiming the Jews are a race. The Muslim and left-wing anti-Semites are claiming the Jews are merely a religion. The former are doing it as part of their racist ideology, the latter are doing it in order to undermine the legitimacy of the State of Israel, and portray it as a religious state. Now, there are some right-wing religious Jews who believe that the Jewish state should become a Jewish theocracy, but they are a small minority, and they lost the debate. Last year, Israel passed a national law that made it very clear that Israel is a Jewish state only in the national sense, and it has nothing to do with the Jewish religion. You can be of any race and any religion, and be part of the Jewish nation. About 5% of the Jews living in Israel today are Christian by faith, and about 25% are atheists. What makes it easier for the anti-Semites to convince people of this lie is that most people know only diaspora Jews, and the secular Jews living in diaspora today are pretty detached from their national identity. I can easily understand it. I myself am of dual nationality, since my mother was born in England, so I have a UK citizenship. That makes me part of the British nation, but I don't feel British. In the same way, diaspora Jews don't feel their Jewish national identity, and many of them are ignorant about the fact that Jews are a nation. However, even those Jews usually maintain rituals that affirm their belonging to the Jewish nation. For instance, most of them celebrate Seder night on Passover, in which they read the Haggadah. The Haggadah is a book through which Jewish parents tell the story of our nation to their children, tell them how our nation was formed, how it won its liberty, and how it became sovereign in our homeland of Israel. Through the Haggadah, Jews have been passing on their national identity from generation to generation, never broken, for thousands of years. And they are still doing so today, even if they don't think about it. When the Jews sing, "We were slaves to the Pharaoh in Egypt," they are not talking about themselves. No Jew living today was ever a slave to the Pharaoh in Egypt. What they are doing is affirming that they belong to that nation that was once enslaved in Egypt. Because of this confusion, I understand it when regular people think that Judaism is a religion, and have a misconception about what a Jewish state means. But I don't accept it when it is coming from a politician, and I do not accept it coming from a political commentator on YouTube.
I don't agree with Islamic states. Any Islamic country, whether it's ISIS who says they're an Islamic country, or whether it's, Iran or Saudi Arabia, I don't agree. They shouldn't, that's not okay. Secularism is a human right. So that's not okay, nor is it okay to have a Jewish state. Yeah, we have a Jewish state here, but you're not allowed to criticize. If you do, you're a bigot. No, if I criticize that, I'm making sense. I'm saying secularism is a human right. You can't have an official Muslim state or Christian state or Jewish state, because that is theocracy by definition.
No, this is you being clueless by definition. You've allowed yourself to be manipulated by anti-Semites into believing that Israel is a theocracy, instead of the secular nation-state that it is, practically the only secular state in the Middle East. You are spreading a lie which isn't anti-Semitic in itself, but which is then used to promote antisemitism. Especially since, as we shall see, it is just one in a web of lies. Let's take another recent case. Dr. Mark Lamont Hill, an academic and a TV commentator, spoke in November before the UN to mark the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. He spoke about the condition of the Palestinians in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority, and ended it by saying this.
We have an opportunity to not just offer solidarity in words, but to commit to political action, grassroots action, local action, and international action that will give us what justice requires. And that is a free Palestine from the river to the sea.
From the river to the sea means from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, an area that contains not just the so-called occupied territories, but also Israel itself. From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, is a slogan that has come to symbolize the Palestinians' age-old refusal to recognize Israel's right to exist. So it seems that Dr. Hill is calling for the elimination of the State of Israel, and denying the right of millions of Jews to be sovereign in their homeland. And yet, if we view the entire speech, we find that he advocates a two-state solution, in which Israel and Palestine coexist side by side. How do we settle this apparent contradiction? Unfortunately, once again, no one in the media tried to analyze it. Hill was accused of antisemitism, got fired from CNN where he was a regular guest, and that was that. So once again, instead of trying to expose the mechanics of today's antisemitism and show the public how to beware of them, the whole thing was just repressed and silenced. It is up to us to make sense of it. So let's look deeper into the speech.
While the Universal Declaration for Human Rights says that all people are, quote, born free and equal in dignity and rights, the Israeli nation-state continues to restrict freedom and undermine equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, as well as those in the West Bank and Gaza.
So what Dr. Hill is saying is that the Palestinians are not free, neither in the occupied territories, nor within Israel. So when he says later that Palestine shall be free from the river to the sea, he means that both Israel and Palestine must become free. When he calls Israel Palestine, he means the land of Palestine, which is the entire area from the river to the sea. This is how the Palestinians call it, in the same way that the Jews call the same area the land of Israel. So Hill simply adopts a Palestinian name. What is wrong about that? Well, first of all, Dr. Hill, if you would have said the land of Palestine, that would have been more tolerable. But don't you go calling my country Palestine. This name is extremely offensive to any Jew. Palestine is the name that the Roman occupiers gave the place, after they destroyed Judea. They decided to completely erase Judea from memory, and so they renamed it, and determined that it is no longer a country but merely a province. So when you call it Palestine, you are using the name that was used to take away our freedom, the name that doomed us to live for 2,000 years as an occupied minority in our homeland, and most of us to live in exile. Secondly, your statement is built on the premise that the Palestinian citizens of Israel are not free. Let's see what you base this claim on.
At the current moment, there are more than 60 Israeli laws that deny Palestinians access to full citizenship rights, simply because they're not Jewish.
Is that so? More than 60 laws, eh? Name one. Hill doesn't name them, but I know where he gets this number from. He gets it from an NGO called Adallah, which has a website that lists more than 60 laws that allegedly discriminate against Arab citizens of Israel. Let's look at some of them. Adallah names the laws that define the Israeli flag, national symbol and anthem as discriminatory. Why? Well, because they are based on Jewish heritage, and therefore discriminate against Arabs. They also have a problem with Saturday, and the Jewish holidays, being designated as the official days of rest in Israel. Israeli law does specify that individuals can choose to have their holidays at other times, according to their own religious beliefs, but that's not good enough for Adallah. In short, all of the laws that characterize Israel as a Jewish nation-state are named as discriminatory. Now, I hope I don't have to tell you that every other country in the world is also a nation-state, and has similar laws. In fact, in some states the national flag and symbols even contain religious imagery, which is not the case with the Israeli symbols. There are some people who think that this is wrong, and that a state should have no national identity but just be a bunch of laws. Personally, I think that it is impossible to maintain a state if you don't have a national ethos binding its citizens together. But if you think differently, Dr. Hill, you are welcome to try to change things. However, start with your country first. Jews are not your guinea pigs. Change the law in America so that the 4th of July, Thanksgiving and Martin Luther King Day are no longer national holidays. Make it illegal for the American government to support institutions like the Smithsonian, which preserve the American heritage. And so forth. After you've done stripping your state of all of its national characteristics, and after you show that it works better that way, then you will have the moral high ground to come and accuse my country of discrimination for having such laws. Until then, you have no right to do so, and doing so makes you an anti-Semite. Make no mistake, people. This is coming to your shores as well. The radical left has for years been using Israel as a test case to advance its ideas. They will try to destroy your national identity as well, using the same tactics, portraying your state as racist for having national characteristics. It already begun. Adallah also has a problem with the laws that give Jews automatic citizenship if they want to immigrate to Israel. Again, this is the same as many other countries. Because my mother was born in England, I can immigrate to the UK and get citizenship right away. Other Israelis cannot. If they want to immigrate to the UK, they have to go through a process that will make them British, and it's exactly the same way in Israel. You can go through a process and become a Jew. One way to do so is to convert to the Jewish religion, since, as mentioned, one of the main tenets of the Jewish religion is that Jews are a nation. Another way is to become part of us, to see yourself as if you too were a slave to the Pharaoh in Egypt. If you do that, and if we Jews are convinced that you mean it, then you become a Jew, no matter what race or religion you are. This option has always been open for the Israeli Arabs as well. They could have assimilated and become part of the Jewish nation, but their political and religious leaderships are actively making sure that they do not integrate. They choose to remain a minority that isn't part of the nation, and then they complain that they are being discriminated.
Through this basic law, the Israeli state has officially rejected Arabic as an official state language.
Is Arabic an official state language in your country, Mark? No? Then why should it be an official language in mine? Let's apply your logic to your country. It's a little more complicated in the US, since it is a union of states, so let's focus on just one state. The state of California has a Mexican minority of about 25% of the population, and yet it defines English as its official language. I guess that means that the Mexicans there are oppressed, and we should do something about it, so that Mexico shall be free, from Yucatan to Oregon. If you think that this is ridiculous, I have news for you. We have not even got to the real absurdities in the Adallah document. Next, they list laws against terrorism. Now, these laws apply against any terrorist, including Jewish terrorists, but Adallah still insists that they discriminate against Palestinians. Why? You guessed it. because most terrorists are Palestinians. Apparently, Adallah believes that terrorism is part of the Arab culture, or part of Arab nature, so it is wrong to make laws against it. Then they list the law against trading with an enemy state, because the only enemy states that Israel has are Arab and Muslim. I hope I don't have to explain why this is absurd. In the past they also listed the law against theft, because Arabs, per capita, commit more theft, and therefore it is discriminatory against them. I see that they removed this article, but there are still articles that have the same logic. Anyway, I think you get the picture. In reality, there are no laws that discriminate against Arabs in the Israeli law book. A problem that we do have here is that the laws don't protect well enough against policies that favor Jews, for instance when it comes to land distribution policies. We tolerate this situation because it is necessary for Israel's survival. Since the question of its borders has not been settled yet, Israel is anxious about Israeli Arabs becoming a majority in a certain area, since they might then demand to make this area part of the future Palestinian state. In other words, these problems are not due to the definition of Israel as a Jewish state, but born out of necessity, because it has to deal with the situation of perpetual existential war. There is a debate within Israel about it, and if you want to criticize Israel on these grounds, fine. But, of course, this is not what Adallah wants you to do. They don't want you to think that Israel is a country trying to maintain a liberal democracy in the face of serious challenges. They want you to think that it is an apartheid state, so they compile this fabricated list and pretend that they are merely an NGO worried about discrimination. So the claim that Israel has over 60 laws that discriminate against Palestinians is yet another lie. But, unlike the lie we exposed earlier, this one is an anti-Semitic lie. It is a libel, aimed at portraying Jews as evil. And anyone repeating this lie, wittingly or unwittingly, is guilty of promoting anti-Semitic propaganda. This is the part in Mark Lamont Hill's speech that the critics should have focused on, but no one did. And so, building on this deceitful basis, Hill could make the "From the River to the Sea" slogan sound like an anti-discrimination slogan, and thus try to legitimize it. And when he was criticized for it, pretend that he is the victim of a witch hunt, and get well-meaning people to take his side and defend his anti-Semitic propaganda.
He was fired by CNN! And they literally argued, or at least the implication was, that's unacceptable because it's anti-Semitic. What? How? How did you get anti-Semite from that? And listen, I watched his entire speech. You saw probably about half of it there, but I saw his entire speech. I read all of his tweets on it, and it's just a flat-out smear against him. That's my takeaway. And again, so you have somebody come out here at the UN and say, I believe in human rights, and we should support BDS to those ends, and what's the first thing you do? So he's anti-Semitic, and then he gets fired.
Are you beginning to understand how you are being duped here, Kyle? Look what you were driven into doing. You defended someone who spread an anti-Semitic libel against the Jewish state, and claimed that there was nothing wrong with what he said. You defended someone who repeated a genocidal slogan against Jews, and you implied that his silencing is the outcome of Jewish power in the media. How easy is it now for an anti-Semite to claim that Israel is an evil state, and getting away with it because Jews control the media, and then rely on Kyle Kulinski to affirm it? Your short-sighted denial of antisemitism is leading you to be its servant.
What a raging anti-Semite. Ugh, gross. I mean, he obviously hates all Jews, and he thinks Jews are inferior.
This is not what antisemitism is, Kyle. The belief that Jews are inferior is only found in Nazi antisemitism, which is a private case of the larger category. The thing that defines antisemitism is the belief that Jews are evil, and scheming against other people. Usually it is expanded into a conspiracy theory, which claims that the Jews are running things from behind the scenes and are plotting to take over the world. You often speak up against antisemitism, but if you don't know what antisemitism is, you are not much of a help in the fight against it. Let's take another recent example. In October 2018, an extreme right-wing anti-Semite shot and killed 11 people in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. Some in the American media tried to blame it on President Trump, and were berated by the Israeli ambassador to the US, who told them that antisemitism can be found on the left as well, and the problem we should focus on is antisemitism, not which political side the shooter came from. Kyle didn't take too kindly to this.
So they're equating a neo-Nazi terrorist who just massacred people. He screamed, "All Jews must die." This guy's equating that to fucking Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party leader in the UK, and the BDS movement, when the BDS movement says, hey, maybe we should give Palestinians human rights also. That's I need you to understand something. That's an argument that's made in bad faith. I don't think that he really thinks those things are equivalent, that you can mention those things in the same sentence or the same breath, but he's doing it anyway because it's an attempt to smear.
Here's a suggestion, Kyle. Supposing we assume that Jews know better than you what antisemitism is, and who the anti-Semites are. Okay? You're right that there is no equivalence between the shooter and the leftists you mentioned, but the ambassador wasn't drawing an equivalence. While it is true that most of the violence comes from right-wing anti-Semites, the propaganda and lies that lead to the violence come mainly from the left. We've already shown a couple of lies, but there are worse. In my video on TYT, we saw how Cenk is spreading a false story that Israel is forcibly sterilizing its Ethiopian citizens. This is antisemitism, Kyle. This is a blood libel, aimed to portray Jews as evil, promoted on a platform much bigger than anything the right-wing anti-Semites have. And if you listen to alt-right people, you will find that this lie about Israel and the Ethiopians is part of their discourse. The left has many people spreading similar anti-Semitic lies, stoking the flames of Jew hatred. They are all complicit in the terrorist attack in Pittsburgh, and they are also helping the cause of jihadi groups, who kill a lot more Jews than the neo-Nazis. And this is what the Israeli ambassador was talking about. Here's another short story that Kyle did on the issue of antisemitism in the academy.
University of California officials are proposing to include anti-Zionism as a form of discrimination that is unacceptable on campus, according to a long-awaited draft statement on intolerance released Tuesday. One letter signed by more than 130 UC faculty members supported naming anti-Zionism as an expression of anti-Semitism. No. This is dead wrong.
Oh goody, Kyle is going to educate us about Zionism.
To be an anti-Semite, to have an irrational hatred of all Jews, that's bigotry. To say, I disagree with Zionism, having an official Jewish state, that's rational.
Really? It's rational to deny the Jewish nation the same right that every other nation has? The right to sovereignty in its homeland? Sounds rather bigoted to me. But Kyle is not a bigot. He simply has no idea what he is talking about. This all goes back to his misconception of what Judaism is, and what the Jewish state means.
I'm saying secularism is a human right. You can't have an official Muslim state or Christian state or Jewish state, because that is theocracy by definition.
But it doesn't end there.
And furthermore, let's be honest about Zionism here. What do people mean when they talk about that?
Why don't you tell us?
Well, people who are Zionists and who are admittedly Zionists, by and large, they're like, yeah, not only do we want a Jewish state, we want all the land. So Palestinians, well, there are no Palestinians, first of all. I love that argument. There are no Palestinians. But we're going to say the Palestinians, even though there are no Palestinians, need to get the fuck off their own land. The settlers should take over more, and the entire region. There shouldn't be a two-state deal. It should all be a Jewish state, and I am a Zionist. I want all the land.
Not even close. A Zionist is someone who believes that the Jews have the right to be sovereign people in their homeland. It spans the entire spectrum of Jewish politics, from far left to far right. In fact, one of the talking points of the Israeli left in recent years has been to characterize the settlement activities of the right as anti-Zionist. And if you truly believe in the two-state solution, Kyle, it means that you too are a Zionist. And it's not like with radical feminists, where they define feminism in a certain way but then use the word in a different way. Zionism has a clear definition, and we Jews all know what we mean when we use this word. Yet you, Kyle, equate Zionism with the extreme right wing of Zionism. Yet another misconception, and once again, a truly harmful one. Because if you legitimize anti-Zionism, you legitimize those who oppose the right of Israel to exist. Worse, you legitimize anti-Semites. The anti-Semites have their own definition of Zionism. It's the word that they use to define those Jews that they believe want to take over the world. Most anti-Semites today define themselves as anti-Zionists, to cloak their antisemitism. Because of your ignorance on what Zionism is, you end up validating them. You are also being really offensive to Jews when you define our national liberation movement in such a way. As a political commentator, you should know better. I mean, you talk a lot about Israel, so I'm sure you did the minimum amount of homework and studied the history of how it was formed, right?
So post World War II, there was a question, well, what do we do with the survivors of the Holocaust and what happens from here? And the UN decided, well, we'll give them Israel in the region which at the time was the Palestinian territory. Now, the problem with how they did it was there was no consulting of the Palestinians. It's like, all right, hey guys, how you doing? Nice to see ya. Anywho, move on over. Israel is right here. Now, naturally, no matter who you are, you would be like, whoa, what? WTF, dog? That's not cool. You can't just take this region. But that's what the UN did. They basically plopped down Israel in this region of the world, which was the Palestinian territory. And from then on, there was naturally fighting that broke out. A lot of the fighting was started by the Palestinians, and then what would happen is there would be they were naturally and understandably upset because a lot of their land was just taken away, and then the fighting ended up getting larger. There were multiple wars, and along that time, from 1947 until today, Israel basically expanded, and then expanded some more, and then expanded some more, and the borders kept getting wider and wider and wider, and the region, which was Palestinian territories, is now at a historic low. If you look at the map, it's a comically tiny amount of space where the Palestinians are essentially living, and they are under occupation.
Amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
So much fail in that one segment that I don't even know where to begin. First of all, Kyle, shame on you for suggesting that the Jews got their rights from the fucking UN. Furthermore, screw you for saying that it was because of the Holocaust, implying that we owe it to the Nazis. The right of the Jews to be sovereign in Israel is derived from the right that every nation has to be sovereign in its homeland. You are not a liberal if you deny this right. And if you do acknowledge this right, and deny it only to the Jews, well, you know what that makes you. Here's another history lesson. Even after the destruction of the Kingdom of Judea by the Romans, Jews kept living in the land of Israel, and it remained an important spiritual and cultural Jewish center for about a millennium. Then came 3 centuries of wars between Muslims, Christians, and Mongols, which ravaged the country. When the dust settled, the land was in the hands of the Mameluke Empire, a Muslim empire that ruled from Egypt. After 2.5 centuries, it was conquered by the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim empire that ruled from Turkey for the next 4 centuries. The Mamelukes and the Ottomans did not see any significance in the land and did not develop it, and it gradually became a remote, thinly populated place made mainly of desert and marshland. The Jewish minority were treated as second-class dhimmis, were not allowed to build new houses or synagogues, and suffered harassment and violence by the Muslim population. Nevertheless, Jews kept migrating to Zion, and diaspora Jews supported them financially to maintain the connection of the Jewish nation to its homeland. In the 19th century, some Jews became very rich, so they could bribe the Ottoman authorities into allowing Jews to buy land, and Jews started to build their homeland again. In World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the land became, from a legal standpoint, no man's land. The newly formed League of Nations decided, in 1922, that it was time to right a historic wrong, and finally allowed the Jewish nation to go back to the land that it is indigenous to, after 2,000 years in which this right was denied of it. The land of Israel was designated as the national home of the Jews, and the British Empire was given a mandate over the land to oversee its formation. Jewish immigration grew, the land was resettled and rebuilt, and it was all done legally. Now, Kyle, you called it the Palestinian territory. This is of course a nonsensical term. There was never any land known as the Palestinian territory. The land was not called Palestine until the League of Nations decided to call it that after World War I. It was an area within the Ottoman Empire, with part of it belonging to the Damascus province and part of it to the Sidon province. There were never Palestinians either. The Arabs who lived in the land did not call themselves Palestinians, and did not consider themselves a nation that is living under the occupation of the Ottoman Empire. They were Ottoman citizens, and for the indigenous Jewish minority, they were just foreign colonizers. Nevertheless, they have been here long enough to also be considered indigenous, and the League of Nations determined that their rights should be kept. It is a demand that all of the factions of the Zionist movement accepted, and agreed that these local Arabs should be part of the country that would be formed. No Arab was forcibly driven off their land, or had their rights taken away. But the Arabs refused to share the land with the Jews, and in the 1920s they launched a campaign of terrorist attacks and pogroms against the growing Jewish population. This was when the Palestinian national identity started to form, and it was born out of total rejection of the basic rights of Jews. In the late 30s, the British authorities eventually capitulated to the Arab violence, and set a quota that heavily limited the number of Jews allowed to immigrate to Zion, which meant that this sanctuary was closed before them just when they needed it the most. Because of this ideology of rejectionism, it became obvious that the Jews and Arabs can't form a shared country, and that led to the partition plan. So now we see how distorted Kyle's description is. The claim that the partition plan was suddenly foisted on the Palestinians, without consulting them, is a gross falsehood. The plan came after decades of consulting with the Palestinians, and was the result of their bigotry and rejectionism. And the implication that the Palestinian violence is a reaction to land being taken away from them is also a falsehood. The violence is born out of an ideology that denies the right of Jews to live in the land of Israel. This was the ideology underlying Palestinian terrorism in the 1920s, and it is still the ideology today. In November 1947, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 181, which calls for the end of the British mandate and the partition of the land into a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. But the UNGA decisions are mere suggestions. They are not legally binding. The suggested plan was then supposed to be ratified by the UN Security Council, and then it would have become international law. But it never got to a vote because of the Arab reaction. The Palestinians intensified their terrorism, and the Arab states threatened that they will invade the Jewish state and massacre the Jews. The Americans, fearing another Holocaust, got cold feet and tried to rethink the partition plan, but the Brits announced that they are going to leave anyway. And so, the world left the Jews to fend for themselves against the 7 Arab countries that declared war on their new state. This was the Israeli Independence War, in which Israel managed to defeat the Palestinians and the invading Arab armies, but only after losing 1% of the Jewish population. That's like the US losing 3.5 million people in a war. Tell us again, Kyle, how Israel was given to the Jews by the UN. After the war, Israel was left holding a bigger part of the land than designated in the partition plan, and the world agreed that it was justified, since Israel needed borders that could be defended against the Arab hostility. Today we call them the pre-1967 borders. The invading Arab countries, of course, had no intention of giving any land to the Palestinians. They wanted to divide the land between themselves. They had to settle for the scraps that were left, though. After the war, the West Bank was left in the hands of Jordan, and Gaza in the hands of Egypt. So, still, there was no such thing as a Palestinian territory. In 1967, the Arab countries ganged up on Israel again, and once again were defeated and lost more land. Israel announced that it will give back the conquered land in return for peace, and since then already gave back more than 90% of it, in exchange for peace deals. Israel also annexed 2 small territories, East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, and this is the only expansion that it has ever done. So your claim that Israel expanded again and again, Kyle, has no leg to stand on. The Palestinians, meanwhile, continued to reject Israel's right to exist, and carried out a campaign of blood-drenched international terrorism against Jews. But Israel only grew stronger, and in the late 80s the PLO, the representative of the Palestinian national movement, signaled that it is willing to recognize its right to exist. This led to the beginning of a peace process in the early 90s. Unfortunately, this coincided with the rise of postmodernism, which brought us historians who believe that their role is not to document history but to create it, by inventing narratives that are loyal not to the historical truth but to a political agenda. And so we got radical leftist pseudo-historians who created false narratives that the land belonged to the Palestinians before the Jews came, that there is no Jewish nation, that it was the Jews who opened the war in 1947, and many other preposterous lies, which is probably where Kyle gets his ideas from. These lies totally screwed up the Palestinians, as they drove them back into adopting irrational positions, believing that they are the innocent victims in this conflict. The people pushing these bullshit narratives believe that they are helping the Palestinians, but they forget that the Palestinians need to make peace with the Jews if they want their situation to get better. And these narratives are so obviously and evidently bullshit that there is no way that the Jews will ever believe and accept them. There will never be a peace deal if the Palestinians keep on basing their demands on these narratives. In short, you are only making it worse for the Palestinians when you promote these lies.
Under international law, all of the land that Israel is on post-1947 is illegal. They're not allowed to be on that land. But the Palestinians are willing to say, okay, we'll even give you more than that, 1967.
More bullshit. When Kyle says post-1947, he is talking as if there were borders in 1947, and the land that Israel conquered in its independence war previously belonged to the Palestinians. But let me remind you that the partition plan was never ratified, so it has no legal status. After the war, Israel was officially recognized in its borders, so the pre-67 borders are what the international law recognizes, and the Palestinians are not making any concessions when they accept them. We can already see that Kyle doesn't understand what the peace process is about, so before we delve into his views on it, I shall provide a short overview of what has transpired from the 90s until now. The Fatah movement, the leader of the PLO, agreed to ditch its former anti-Semitic and genocidal ideology and open a peace process with Israel. The process was based on the concept of land for peace. Israel will withdraw from lands to enable the Palestinians to form a state, and the Palestinians, in return, will recognize Israel's right to exist and stop the violence against it. To begin with, the Palestinians were given autonomy and control over part of the land, and formed the Palestinian Authority. And so, for the first time in history, there is a Palestinian territory. In that, Israel exposed its citizens to terrorist attacks, and this was a test for Fatah to show that it can indeed deliver peace, and prevent the terrorism. If they could show that, we could negotiate a final deal, in which the Palestinians would form a state in the West Bank and Gaza. Unfortunately, the Palestinians also have the Hamas movement, a jihadi organization with an ideology that is even more anti-Semitic and genocidal than Fatah's ever was. Hamas rejected the peace process, and launched a campaign of suicide bombers to sabotage it. And so, the terrorism increased threefold, and the Palestinians failed to live up to their side of the deal. Nevertheless, the peace process soldiered on, and Israel gave more and more lands to the PA. It became evident, however, that the gaps between the sides are too wide to bridge, so in the middle of the 2000s Israel had another plan: unilaterally withdraw from most of the territory, let the Palestinians form a state, and wait until they are ready to make peace. The belief was that Israel is strong enough to deter the Palestinians from using their state as a launchpad for terrorism. In 2005, Israel withdrew from all of Gaza, and prepared to withdraw from most of the West Bank as well. But then, in 2006, the Palestinian people voted for Hamas to be their leader. Hamas then proceeded to murder its Fatah rivals, take full control over Gaza, and impose Islamist rule over it. In the West Bank, Israel helped Fatah defeat Hamas and take full control, and so we have a situation similar to North Korea and South Korea. The Palestinians are one nation that is split into two enemy entities, with different ideologies. So far they have failed to reconcile. The Hamas government of Gaza denies Israel's right to exist, and created a jihadist army which, among other things, fires rockets into Israeli civilian populations. Israel reacted by placing a blockade on Gaza, aimed at preventing this army from getting stronger, and it gave the Gaza government 3 conditions for the removal of the blockade. Recognize Israel's right to exist, renounce terrorism, and ratify the agreements Israel made with previous Palestinian governments. It has been more than a decade, and Hamas still refuses to accept these conditions. They would rather let the Palestinian people wither under the blockade than give up on the aspiration to eliminate Israel. I was hoping that with the help of international pressure, we could get Hamas to give up on this ideology, but here is where most of the Western left expose its true face. Instead of supporting the parties that want peace and helping Israel put pressure on Hamas, it has taken the side of the Gaza government, pressuring Israel to remove the blockade. This gives Hamas hope that Israel will one day have to bow to the pressure, so they refuse to budge. This turn of events completely destroyed any chance to make peace in the near future. Think about it. Let's say we sign a peace agreement with the Palestinian government, which gives them full sovereignty over the West Bank and Gaza. What's to prevent the Palestinians from then revoking the agreements, announcing that their true aim is the annihilation of Israel and the Jews, and going back to violence? Experience has shown them that they can do that, and a large part of the international community will still be on their side. And we see that Israel's military might is not enough to deter them. So a peace deal in the near future is out. We have to wait until the Palestinian culture changes to a point where they would prefer having a good life over jihad against the Jews. Then Israel will have the power to deter them, and peace will become possible. As for the West Bank Fatah government, it is willing to make peace with Israel and does recognize Israel's right to exist, but not as a Jewish state, which is also worthless. Imagine that China attacks Japan and wants to conquer it, and then, after failing, agrees to make peace with it, but only if it can still retain the right to undermine it and try to change it into a Chinese state. In 2009, Israel elected a right-wing government headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, who demands of Fatah to recognize Israel as a Jewish state as a condition to continue the talks. This is where I, like many other leftists, disagree with Netanyahu. I don't think the Palestinians are ready for it, and I think we should advance on other issues before we make this demand. However, I do of course recognize that the demand is justified, and since the majority of Israelis seem to agree with Netanyahu's position, I am behind my government on this. The Fatah government, however, refuses to comply with this demand, and so we have a stalemate for the last decade. So this is where we are. Now let's go back to secular talk.
Hamas, even, for years now, has said, okay, we'll take the two-state deal along the 1967 borders. You know who says no? Israel.
Yeah, we've seen the same nonsense coming from Cenk. I don't know where they get this idea from. These progressives are living in some bubble that has no connection to reality, at least when it comes to Hamas. I'll say it again, Hamas is a jihadist organization, and its raison d'etre is the elimination of Israel. They always make it very clear that they will never ever recognize Israel's right to exist, in any borders. So Kyle doesn't understand the relations between Israel and Gaza. What about its relation with the West Bank?
Since then, recently, you had the Palestinians propose through Jordan at the United Nations a peace deal which said, all right, let's do the 1967 borders, let's split Jerusalem, and let's iron out all the other details that we need to iron out, water rights and other things.
So, you're presenting it like it's some new suggestion. That's basically been the Fatah position from the start. But those are the easy parts. What about, say, the right of return? You do know about the right of return, right, Kyle?
Extremists on the Palestinian side, they've said, well, we don't want Israel to exist. And we want it, what's it called, right to return, is it? Or we just get all the land back and Israel stops existing.
Uh-huh. And that's the right of return, is it? You don't know what the right of return is, do you, Kyle? You think that it means the elimination of Israel. So when Fatah upholds the two-state solution, you think that this means that they gave up on the right of return, don't you? The right of return is about the Palestinian refugees from the Israeli independence war. As mentioned, Israel was attacked by its neighbors, which compelled it to conquer more lands and create defensible borders. To be able to hold these lands, it also meant that it needed to drive away part of the Palestinian population, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians became refugees. This is justified in war, as long as you let the refugees come back to their homes once the war is over. After the war, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 194, which included an article saying that the Palestinians who wish to return to their home in Israel and live peacefully with their Jewish neighbors should be allowed to do so. This is what is known as the right of return. However, there were no Palestinians willing to go back and live peacefully with their Jewish neighbors. The Arabs kept on believing that they will eventually destroy Israel, so they maintained a state of war with it. Which means that Israel can't take the refugees back. The Arab states put the refugees in camps, and there their descendants remain to this day. Most of the Palestinians remained in Israel, though, and were eventually given Israeli citizenship. Had they integrated and become part of the Jewish nation, it would have opened the way for the refugees to return and be accepted as Jews. But, as mentioned, they refused to be part of the Jewish nation. And yet, they still want the right of return into the state that belongs to the nation that they don't want to be a part of. This is the main reason why they refuse to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. They know that this will lead to either giving up on the right of return or having to become Jews in order to get it.
Now, let's also be clear about one other thing. Are there some people affiliated with BDS who would want right to return? I'm sure there are. Are they going to get that, and are they right to want that? No and no.
The right of return is a consensus in the Palestinian society, Kyle. It is sacred to them. Because of their skewed perception of history, they believe that justice demands that the refugees return to their homes. You uphold their version of history on the one hand, and on the other hand you tell them that they should forget about the right of return. You are not going to get anywhere with them with that position, nor with that dismissive attitude.
And then there are people who are more reasonable and voices of moderation who can come together and make a deal.
Actually, no. There are no people who can make a deal. The most moderate Israeli position is still miles away from the most moderate Palestinian position. There is still a decades-long process that we have to go through before we reach the point where we can make peace. Anyone who thinks otherwise is delusional. So Kyle doesn't know what the conflict is about, and yet it doesn't prevent him from commenting on the peace process. He repeatedly characterizes it as a process in which the Palestinians are trying to get their rights and running into Israeli rejectionism.
So the Palestinians, they try to negotiate directly with Israel. Israel says, no, we're not going to give you any of that. Then there's a violent reaction, and they go, I can't believe you're fucking being violent. All we did was steal your land and kick you off of it. I can't believe you're being violent in your reaction. That's crazy. And nothing works that way. And then when they try to go to the UN, Israel goes, I can't believe you're going to the UN. Why don't you come negotiate directly with us? So my question is, what do you want the Palestinians to do?
Here's what we want the Palestinians to do. Let's start with the Hamas government of Gaza. They should comply with Israel's demands and agree to recognize Israel's right to exist, renounce terrorism, and ratify previous agreements. This should take 5 minutes, and after that the blockade will be lifted and Gaza can grow and prosper. Once they do that, it should also be possible for them to reconcile with Fatah and reunite the two parts of the Palestinian Authority. As for the Fatah government of the West Bank, it should recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Again, it's a simple 5 minutes declaration, and after that the peace talks can resume. And, of course, they should start operating on that basis, meaning stop trying to undermine the legitimacy of Israel, educate the Palestinians that Jews have rights in this land, and realize that you are not going to get the right of return. This is the Israeli position, and it is in line with the two-state solution, which is more than can be said for the position of any of the two Palestinian governments. So if you truly believe in the two-state solution, Kyle, you should be more on the side of the Israeli government and blame the Palestinians for their rejectionism. One thing that you can't justifiably criticize Israel on is its expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Again, you have to beware of the anti-Semitic lies on the subject. The story that they are spreading is that Israel is demolishing Palestinian houses and taking away their land in order to build Jewish settlements on it. This is not true. But it is true that Israel is building in the West Bank, in a land that isn't hers according to international law, and thus creating facts on the ground which is against the spirit of the peace process. What do you think should be done with the Israeli settlements, Kyle?
And when people say, hey, that's not practical, what are you going to do with all the areas that Israel has taken over and they're settling? Here's what you do. Get the fuck out of there. You shouldn't be there in the first place. You shouldn't have expanded. You shouldn't have done settlements. You shouldn't have pushed past the 1947 borders to begin with. You were wrong to do that, So now, oh gosh, it's so hard for us to take 3 weeks and move away from that. That's too fucking bad.
That's cold, Kyle. That's really cold. The West Bank is what we call Judea, and it is the heart of the Jewish homeland. Jews have lived in Judea since biblical times, enduring all the occupiers that came along. Then, in 1929, there was a series of pogroms in which the Palestinians murdered more than 100 Jews, and the British authorities realized that they can't protect them. So they transferred all the Jews out of Judea to the Tel Aviv area, and for the first time in thousands of years there were no Jews in Judea. In 1967, Israel conquered the land, and Jews started to resettle it. Demanding that they leave it again is not justice. They should stay there as citizens of the Palestinian state, and become part of the Palestinian nation. It really doesn't sound like you care about the people involved in this conflict, Kyle. You show no interest in what they want, what they fear, what is dear to them, what they stand to lose, and you spend no time thinking about the very complicated question of how we can find a solution that will make everyone sufficiently happy.
But that could just be because I'm not educated enough on the issue and Mark Lamont Hill is significantly more educated on it than I am.
No, you're not. You're really not, which is why he could manipulate you the way he did. We've established that you don't know what Judaism is, you don't know what Zionism is, you don't know how to detect antisemitism, you don't know the history of the conflict, you don't know the points of contention, you don't know what the position of every side is, you don't know much of anything. But there is one thing that you do know, right, Kyle? There is one thing that you are sure about. You know that you should boycott one of the sides in this conflict that you know nothing about.
We're going to non-violently and peacefully try to boycott businesses in occupied territory on illegal settlements. We're going to try to divest. We're going to try to get sanctions on you. Non-violent, peaceful protest.
Kyle is one of the supporters of the BDS movement. As we hear, he characterizes it as a non-violent resistance movement. Resistance to what? Well, before we see what Kyle thinks it is, let's check out what their website says. Basically, they have 3 goals. 1. To end the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. 2. To get equality for Israeli Arabs. This is based on the lie that Israeli law discriminates against Arabs. As we've seen, what's behind this lie is the denial of the right of Jews to have a Jewish state. 3. The right of return, which will flood Israel with millions of Palestinian refugees and effectively turn it into a Palestinian state. So basically, it's an organization dedicated to the destruction of Israel, using economic means. Now, we've seen Kyle opposing the third part, so why is he in favor of this organization?
BDS, which again, people say that there's literally an argument from corporate Democrats and Republicans that that is anti-Semitic. But that's beyond ridiculous because on its face, it's not. All they're saying is, hey, let's apply economic pressure, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions on Israel so that we get human rights for Palestinians.
A human rights organization, Kyle, is an organization that believes in human rights for all humans, even if they are Jews. If the BDS declared it believes in the human rights of Jews as well, and acknowledged Israel's right to exist, then you could say it stands for human rights. But they continuously refuse to do so. You never really bothered to check what this organization stands for, did you, Kyle? BDS is nothing. The effect that it has on the Israeli economy is negligible. It is not something that concerns Israelis, and it has no effect on Israeli policy. Except for one thing.
Responding to international boycott pressures and other constraints, a growing number of Israeli companies operating in the West Bank are moving their facilities to locations within the country's internationally recognized borders, according to a report prepared by an anti-occupation organization that monitors such activities. The report obtained by Haaretz shows that, aside from the recent high-profile cases like SodaStream, the seltzer machine manufacturer, other prominent Israeli companies have also been part of this trend, even if they have managed to evade publicity. So, you ready for the numbers? They say roughly 20 to 30% of the companies that were in the West Bank, in occupied territories, are now gone. BDS is working. That's what that means.
And what did you achieve, Kyle? What did you achieve? made thousands of Palestinians lose their jobs, took away the livelihood of Palestinian families, vanquished some more of our hope to have a normal life here? Is that what you are orgasming about? Part of the peace process is the idea that Israel should help the Palestinians economically, get them on their feet. Our hope is that if they become a prosperous society, they will want to move away from the violence and death. Now, international companies would not put their factories in an unstable place like the West Bank, and the Palestinians themselves have so far not shown that they have the ingenuity to create successful businesses of their own. It's a problem that the entire Arab world has. So they are dependent on Israeli businesses to set up shops there. This is quite a headache for the Israeli companies, but for the sake of peace, some of them agreed to do it. And now you're working to take even that away. You know, Kyle, there are many Jews and Palestinians who have worked tirelessly to try to get peace and normalcy for the two nations. We put in a lot of effort, we made sacrifices, we endured a lot of pain. To then be repeatedly stabbed in the back by the Western left, to see them working to demolish everything that we have achieved, is heartbreaking. I'm way over it though. I got over it 10 years ago, after years of trying to explain to those leftists how they are harming our efforts. I finally realized that there's no reasoning with them, because for them, the conflict is all part of this.
These ambitions have been particularly helpful when attempting to keep track of the vulnerable against the backdrop of imperialism, exploitative economic arrangements, white supremacy, patriarchy, and all the other entanglements of the modern nation-state.
In other words, they don't see humans, they see structures. When it comes to humans, they can only think in terms of groups, with one group being the oppressor and the other the oppressed, and the oppressor is all evil while the oppressed is an innocent victim. Years later we called them the regressive left, i.e. leftists whose ideology drives them to give up on the ideals of enlightenment and regress into a tribal and bigoted position. I try to explain to them the damage that they are doing, but I realize that I am talking to anti-Semites, who see Jews as the evil oppressors and cannot see them any other way. As a peace activist, I realize that they are my enemies, part of the people we need to defeat in order to achieve peace and prosperity for Jews and Palestinians. And Kyle, you are not like that, but, at least on this issue, you are what I call a passive-aggressive. Because you didn't study the subject that you talk about, you are easily manipulated by these regressives into adopting immoral and, frankly, moronic positions.
And then eventually, you're going to actually squeeze people who are well off in Israel, and then they turn to the government and they press the government. I'm losing money like a motherfucker here. You're going to have to do something to fix this problem and to make it so the boycotts stop. Because I can't keep losing money. And if we got to sit down at the table, if we got to make some kind of two-state deal, as long as it allows us to not have our economy squeezed anymore, fine, we'll do it. We'll do it.
Not a chance, Kyle. And I'll tell you why. If you force Israel into agreeing to the two-state solution without the Palestinians recognizing its right to exist as a Jewish state, it means that after the Palestinians get their state, they will go back to violence. Now, if they have control over the West Bank, it will mean that every major city in Israel will be in range of homemade rockets. One rocket a week fired into a city is enough to destroy the economy of that city. So the economy of Israel will be destroyed. Israel will have to react harshly, a lot harsher than today, which means that the boycotts will also be a lot harsher. In other words, it will lead to a situation that is much worse than anything your puny BDS movement can wreak. Every Israeli understands this simple equation, so we are immune to any economic pressure. Like I said, I've given up on trying to reason with regressive leftists on this issue. They don't give a fuck that their actions are causing people in my region to suffer and die. But I am making this effort to reach you, Kyle, because I think that you are better than that. That you actually do care. And if you do, there is actually a way in which you can help. As I said, there are people on the ground, Jews and Palestinians, who are trying to bridge the gaps and bring peace. It's a Sisyphean struggle, and it is made even harder because it is being sabotaged by outside forces. We've seen how the regressive left sabotages it, but this is just one example. There are many other groups that are exploiting this conflict to advance their own political agenda. Jihadists, evangelicals, right-wing anti-Semites, anti-Muslim bigots, Arab dictators, communists, anarchists, all interpret the conflict in their own distorted way, pouring their poisonous lies into the debate and enhancing the hate in the region. They are also enhancing the hate towards Jews and Muslims in other parts of the world. We need voices to debunk them, to expose their lies. You have a considerably large platform, from which you can reach a lot of people. If you make the effort to study this conflict, you can become a voice of truth against all these lies. Right now you are part of the problem. With a little work, you can become part of the solution.